What if I told you that in the next 7 days, events could unfold that shift the balance of power, money, and influence in ways most people aren't even thinking about? Not in 10 years, not in 5 years, but this week. And while the headlines keep you focused on day-to-day drama, the deeper changes, the ones that affect you, are happening almost invisibly. Today, let's pull back the curtain and look at what's really happening, and why the next 7 days might matter more than people realize. So stick with me until the end, because this video you won't want to miss. There's something fascinating about how we perceive change. Most of us wake up each morning expecting the world to work roughly the same way it did yesterday. Your bank account will be there. The grocery store will accept your credit card. The medication you need will be available at a predictable price. We live our lives assuming these basic systems will continue functioning as they always have. But what happens when that assumption breaks down? Think about it this way. Imagine you've been driving the same route to work for 30 years. You know every turn, every traffic light, every shortcut. Then one morning, you discover they've built an entirely new highway system overnight, and your familiar route leads nowhere. That's essentially what's happening to the global economy right now, and most people are still trying to take the old roads. For decades, we've operated under what economists call predictable cycles. Markets go up, they come down, then they recover. Countries trade with each other following established patterns. One currency strengthens, while another weakens, but the overall system remains stable. We've built our retirement plans, our investment strategies, even our daily budgets around these predictable patterns. But sometimes, the cycle breaks. Sometimes, the rules that governed economic life for generations suddenly stop applying. And when that happens, the people who recognize it first, who adapt their thinking to the new reality, tend to fare much better than those who keep expecting yesterday's rules to work tomorrow. Here's what's particularly interesting. These shifts rarely announce themselves with dramatic headlines. Instead, they happen through a series of seemingly small changes that, when you connect the dots, reveal something much larger taking place. It's like watching the first few pieces of a jigsaw puzzle come together individually. They don't make much sense, but together they start revealing a picture that changes everything. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now in trade, inflation, and global alliances. Let me paint you a picture of what's really happening behind those boring trade statistics you might glimpse in the business news. You've probably heard that trade tensions have been escalating, tariffs going up, sanctions being imposed, countries getting into economic disputes. On the surface, it sounds like the usual political theater, countries flexing their muscles, making demands, eventually working things out. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find something remarkable happening that most news reports completely miss. Imagine you own a small shop in a town where the biggest customer suddenly decides they don't want to buy from you anymore. They put up barriers, make it expensive and difficult for people to purchase your goods. What would you do? You'd find new customers, right? You'd adapt, innovate, maybe even discover that these new customers were better to work with than the original one. That's essentially what's happening on a global scale right now. Recent export data reveals something that should make every American sit up and take notice. Chinese exports to the United States have indeed declined, that part you might have heard. But here's what the headlines don't tell you. Their exports to everywhere else have increased by even more than their American sales declined. Think about that for a moment. While America was busy building walls, the rest of the world was building bridges. And those bridges are carrying more traffic than the old roads ever did. It's like water flowing downhill block one stream, and the water just finds a new path. But in this case, the water isn't just finding any path. It's finding better, more efficient paths that might permanently change the landscape. What does this mean for you? Well, imagine if your neighborhood grocery store suddenly decided to stop selling products from certain suppliers. Initially, you might think this would hurt those suppliers. But what if those suppliers responded by opening their own stores, offering better prices and more variety than your original grocery store ever did? Eventually, you might find yourself shopping at the new stores instead, and your original grocery store might find itself struggling to compete. This shift is happening across entire industries and continents. Countries that used to rely heavily on American markets are discovering new trading partners. They're forming economic relationships that bypass traditional systems entirely. And here's the crucial part. Many of these new relationships are proving more profitable and stable than the old ones. But here's the catch. While trade flows around us, the US is facing a very different problem. We're not just dealing with changing trade patterns, we're confronting something economists call the impossible triangle, trying to achieve economic goals that fundamentally contradict each other. On one hand, we're implementing policies designed to bring manufacturing back home and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. That sounds great in theory. But on the other hand, these same policies are driving up the cost of goods for American consumers. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is experiencing the opposite effect, an oversupply of goods that's driving prices down. Imagine you're running a household budget and suddenly your grocery bill starts going up while your neighbor's grocery bill starts going down. At first, you might think it's just temporary, but what happens when that trend continues month after month, year after year? Eventually, the fundamental economics of your household start to look very different from your neighbors. That's exactly what we're seeing between America and much of the rest of the world right now. We're dealing with rising prices due to tariffs and trade barriers, while other regions are experiencing deflation from oversupply. Economists have a term for what happens when you get rising prices combined with slowing economic growth: stagflation. And it's one of the most challenging economic conditions to navigate. For those of you who lived through the 1970 seconds, you might remember how stagflation felt. Prices going up while opportunities seem to shrink. It's a particularly difficult environment for people on fixed incomes because the purchasing power of your savings erodes while the economy doesn't provide the growth needed to offset those losses. But here's what makes the current situation different from the 1970 seconds. Back then, the entire world was generally facing similar challenges. Today, we're creating economic conditions that diverge sharply from what other countries are experiencing. And when economies pull in opposite directions, businesses and investors start making decisions that affect everyone's future. Let's talk about what this means in practical terms. Imagine you're the CEO of a manufacturing company, and you're deciding where to build your next factory. You're looking at two options: one in a region where costs are rising due to trade barriers and regulatory changes, and another in a region where costs are stable or declining due to increased supply and efficiency. As a business person, which would you choose? It's not a difficult decision, and that's exactly the calculation that business leaders around the world are making right now. Even companies that have announced plans to move production to America are finding ways to delay those moves, waiting to see if current policies will change. There's a pattern emerging in corporate announcements that's quite telling. Companies make grand pronouncements about investing billions in American facilities, but when you look at the fine print, you'll notice something interesting. The timelines for these investments often extend 4 to 10 years into the future. That's a carefully chosen time frame, because it pushes the actual commitment well beyond the current political cycle. Why would companies do this? Because they're making a bet that current policies aren't sustainable. They're betting that the economic contradictions we're creating will eventually force changes. So they make public commitments that sound impressive in today's headlines, while privately planning for a very different future. This isn't just about manufacturing either. It affects everything from technology development to financial services. When American companies find it increasingly difficult to access global markets, and when foreign companies find it expensive to do business in America, the entire ecosystem of innovation and investment begins to shift.
For people planning their retirement or managing their savings, this creates a complex challenge. The traditional advice has been to diversify your investments across different sectors and regions.
But what happens when the economy you're most familiar with starts operating under fundamentally different rules from the rest of the world? This brings us to a larger question that most Americans aren't comfortable asking. What happens when the country that's been the center of the global economy for the better part of a century is no longer in that position? Which leads us to the bigger picture. This isn't just about trade, it's about power. And throughout history, shifts in economic power have always preceded shifts in political and military power. The signs are there if you know how to read them, and they're remarkably consistent with patterns we've seen before. Think about the great powers of history. The British Empire at its peak controlled roughly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. For over a century, British naval power, financial systems, and industrial capacity made London the center of global commerce. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British companies dominated international trade. British universities attracted the brightest minds from around the world. But empires don't collapse overnight. They decline gradually, often while their leaders and citizens remain convinced of their continued dominance. The British Empire was still expanding in some regions even as it was losing influence in others. The key indicators of decline, economic, technological, military, were visible for decades before the political reality caught up. History shows us that empires struggle most when they try to maintain control through force, rather than adapting to changing circumstances. They overextend themselves, fighting battles they can no longer afford, trying to preserve systems that no longer serve them well. And, perhaps most importantly, they remain in denial about the fundamental shifts taking place around them. The parallels to America's current situation are striking, though not necessarily deterministic. We're seeing classic signs of imperial overextension, military commitments that strain resources, economic policies that isolate us from former allies, and a domestic political system that's more focused on internal conflicts than external challenges. But here's what's particularly concerning. Denial isn't just political, it shows up in economics too. When nations convince themselves that their traditional advantages are permanent, they stop making the investments necessary to maintain those advantages. They stop adapting to new technologies, new trading patterns, new forms of international cooperation. Consider this. America represents roughly 4.5% of the world's population. That means over 95% of the world's people live elsewhere. For decades, American economic and military power was so overwhelming that this numerical disadvantage didn't matter much. We could set the rules, and everyone else had to follow them. But what happens when that overwhelming advantage erodes? What happens when other countries develop their own advanced technologies, their own financial systems, their own military capabilities? Suddenly, being 4.5% of the world's population in a world where everyone else has alternatives becomes a very different proposition. This isn't abstract geopolitical theory, it has direct implications for American retirees and savers. When the dollar's role as the dominant global currency comes under pressure, it affects everything from inflation to investment returns. When American companies lose market share in global industries, it affects employment and stock prices. When other countries develop alternatives to American-dominated financial systems, it affects the long-term stability of American institutions. And that's exactly what we're witnessing with the rise of new power blocs. The numbers here are quite revealing, and they represent one of the most significant shifts in global economics since the end of World War II. For most of the past 75 years, global economic decisions were made by a relatively small group of countries: the United States, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. This group, known as the G7, controlled the vast majority of the world's economic output, technological innovation, and financial systems. But here's where the numbers become fascinating. Today, these 7 countries, representing some of the world's most advanced economies, account for roughly a quarter to a third of global economic output. That's still substantial, but it's a dramatic decline from their historical dominance. Now, compare that to a different group of countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with about a dozen other nations that have joined their economic alliance in recent years. This group, known as BRICS+, now represents over a third of global economic output, and that percentage is growing every year. Think about what this means. For the first time since World War II, we have 2 major economic power blocs, and the one that used to be dominant is now the smaller of the 2. But the numbers become even more striking when you consider population. The BRICS+ alliance represents between 50 and 60% of the world's people. The G7 represents less than 20%. When you're talking about long-term economic potential, population matters enormously, especially when those populations are becoming increasingly educated and technologically sophisticated. This shift becomes visible in practical ways that affect everyday life around the world. When any country needs to build infrastructure, a railroad, a port, a hospital system, they used to automatically turn to Western companies and financing. American and European firms dominated these markets for decades. But that's changing rapidly. Today, if you look at the major infrastructure projects being built in Africa, you'll find that most of them are being financed and constructed by Chinese companies. The same is true for port developments in Latin America and railroad systems across Asia. These aren't just isolated projects. They represent a systematic shift in how the world builds its future. Why is this happening? Because the Chinese and their partners are often offering better terms, faster completion times, and fewer political conditions than traditional Western alternatives. It's pure market economics at work. For countries seeking development, this competition is actually beneficial. They can now compare offers and choose the best option for their needs. But for American and European companies that used to dominate these markets, it represents a fundamental challenge to their business models. And here's where it gets particularly interesting. This isn't just about traditional industries like construction and manufacturing. The competition has moved into the most advanced sectors of the economy, including the technologies that will define the next several decades. Consider electric vehicles. The vehicles I make, just a few years ago, Tesla was leading the global transition to electric transportation. Today, sadly enough for me, Chinese companies have not only caught up, but have moved ahead in several key areas. Their vehicles are often less expensive and increasingly competitive in terms of quality and features to what I'm building. Or take solar energy. The technology for converting sunlight into electricity was largely developed in American laboratories and universities. But today, Chinese companies dominate global solar panel production, and they continue to innovate at a pace that makes it difficult for American companies to compete. Perhaps most remarkably, Chinese companies have developed battery technology that can recharge electric vehicles in under 10 minutes faster than it takes to fill a conventional car with gasoline. This isn't incremental improvement. It's the kind of breakthrough that changes entire industries overnight. The pattern is consistent across multiple sectors: artificial intelligence, telecommunications, renewable energy, high-speed rail, and even space technology. In each case, American companies that once held clear technological advantages are finding themselves in increasingly competitive races with companies they used to dismiss as mere imitators. What makes this particularly challenging is that technological leadership tends to be self-reinforcing. The countries and companies that lead in one generation of technology are better positioned to lead in the next generation. They attract the best talent, receive the most investment, and develop the most advanced supply chains. So when we talk about the next 7 days potentially being pivotal, we're not just talking about immediate policy changes or market movements. We're talking about decisions that could accelerate or decelerate these long-term technological and economic trends. But here's what might be the most concerning aspect of this shift. While other countries are investing heavily in the foundations of future economic competitiveness, America appears to be moving in the opposite direction in some crucial areas. Take education, for example. Recent surveys show that enrollment in American colleges and universities is declining, particularly among young men. The reasons are complex rising costs, changing attitudes toward higher education, economic pressures, but the trend is unmistakable. At the same time, Chinese universities are expanding rapidly, both in size and in quality. They're attracting students, not just from China, but from around the world, including increasing numbers of American students who find they can get a quality education abroad without the crushing debt that's become common in the American system. This might seem like an abstract policy issue, but it has very direct implications for economic competitiveness. The jobs of the future in technology, engineering, advanced manufacturing, and scientific research require highly educated workforces. If America is producing fewer college graduates while other countries are producing more, the long-term implications for American prosperity are significant. The irony is that American political leaders often talk about bringing manufacturing back to America, but many American companies are reluctant to make those investments because they're not confident they'll have access to the skilled workers they need. This creates a vicious cycle. Without the promise of skilled workers, companies don't invest in advanced manufacturing. Without advanced manufacturing jobs, young people don't see the value in pursuing technical education. Without technical education, the workforce becomes less competitive globally, and so on. Meanwhile, the most prosperous parts of America, the financial centers in New York, and the technology hubs in California and Massachusetts continue to do well. But this success increasingly depends on their connections to global markets and global talent pools. These regions prosper not because they're isolated from global competition, but because they're deeply integrated into it. This creates a troubling dynamic within the country. The regions that benefit most from global integration continue to thrive, while the regions that have been displaced by global competition struggle economically. This geographic inequality contributes to the political polarization that makes it difficult to develop coherent, long-term economic strategies. The people in struggling regions understandably want policies that will bring back economic opportunities. But many of the policies designed to help them trade barriers, immigration restrictions, industrial protections, may actually make it harder for the country as a whole to compete in emerging global markets. It's a classic example of how short-term political incentives can conflict with long-term economic needs. Politicians respond to the immediate concerns of their constituents, But the solutions that make political sense may not make economic sense in a rapidly changing global environment. This dynamic helps explain why American foreign policy has become increasingly